Hi, so today we have the privilege of speaking with Professor Cecil Konijnendijk, the visionary behind the groundbreaking 330-300 rule, here known as the trees rule because it's going to be difficult saying 330-300. Professor Konijnendijk is a distinguished scholar in urban forestry and green space management, renowned for his innovative contributions to creating healthier and more vibrant cities, which we all want. The trees rule is an evidence-based guideline aimed at improving urban green spaces. I'm going to let Cecil explain the rule, but essentially it serves as a blueprint for creating sustainable and livable cities worldwide, integrating more greenery into urban environments for the benefit of all. It's open access and can be implemented globally, which I believe is the vision. Professor Cecil Konijnendijk, welcome to your digital trip down under, where the green and blue infrastructure conversations are running red hot. It is such a pleasure to meet you.
Great to be with you, Belinda, and thanks so much for having me share my views on where we have to go with our green infrastructure and our urban forest.
Yeah, it's great to have your expertise over it, and a lot are really familiar with your rule, but for those of you that may not have heard of it, could you start by explaining the 330-300 rule, or the trees rule, and what inspired its creation?
Yeah, so basically the rule combines three components. So the importance of visible green, so the green that we can see from where we work or we go to school, where we live, of course. Then it actually looks at functional or surrounding green through the metric of canopy cover. And of course, it also looks at the more conventional kind of accessible green parks, etc. So to combine those, it calls for everybody to see three larger mature trees from where they live, work, or go to school, or maybe where they are cared for example, in a hospital. Then it also asks for at least 30% tree canopy cover at the neighborhood level. So not as a city average, because that can actually lead to large dissimilarities or inequity, but really at the neighborhood level. And finally, in line with the World Health Organization's recommendation, it calls for having a larger public green space of high quality within a 300 meters walk or bike ride. And large, I mean, yeah, at least 0.51 hectare, I would say. So 330-300 visible, functional, and accessible green. And I came to it, to be honest, by actually during the COVID pandemic about 3 years ago. I was living in Barcelona, and I came across some research from Australia by Thomas Estelbert and Chao Fang, who actually found every time they ran models that higher canopy cover is related with several health benefits. For example, people sleep better, cardiovascular health is better, general health, mental health are better. And they actually went up to 30% and found increases going up to 30% tree canopy cover. And that in combination with some other research that's seen on climate adaptation made me realize that 30% is a minimum we need to strive for. And then visible green, there's more research coming out on that. And then, of course, also the WHO guideline. And certainly it clicked. I realized there is this trees for trees magic formula that actually can help us in a very simple way, a very easily communicable way to highlight the importance of nearby green space to all of us.
And addressing that need for having some metrics and targets and something to aspire to. Well,
very true. Yeah.
And great shout out to our wonderful professors down at the Power Lab here and the great research they are doing. So as I said, there are, a lot of practitioners in Australia are familiar with your rule, and I was able to crowdsource some questions about its implementation, some questions that people have about it down in Australia. So the first being, many urban greening initiatives include features like green walls, green roofs and facades. How do these initiatives contribute to achieving targets like 330, the trees rule? And is the primary focus on trees and parks, or does it encompass these other forms of urban greening as well?
I think that's a great question. So obviously the trees rule has a strong tree component, and that's based, of course, on research that shows that trees are the strongest vegetation element when it comes to things like adaptation to climate change, health promotion and other benefits, air pollution reduction, etc. But of course, that doesn't disqualify all the other important elements of green space as well. And in the 300, of course, there's already an element of high quality green space that could be all kinds of parks, woodland areas, but it could also be, for example, a publicly accessible cemetery, could be a community garden, even a pocket park in some cases. And then, of course, I see it really as an entry point, a discussion to bring along then also other types of green and realize that, well, to actually do this in a good way, we have to design our green infrastructure carefully. We have to have layered vegetation. We have to bring green space to our buildings. And in areas where, for example, there's very high density, or we have historical urban centers, and so it may be hard to get more trees planted. So there, where we cannot get 30% tree canopy, we can of course also try to use other types of green space. And so it is really a combination. Trees is kind of the entry point, but it brings along all the other green as well.
Great, thanks for clarifying. And can you elaborate on how that 30% coverage is, the target is calculated? So is there a distinction? You mentioned it is focused on trees, but is there a distinction between trees and, say, connected canopy cover? I suppose the question is about, is there anything within the rule that helps to prioritize connectivity, such as, green corridors and things that span across those municipal local council areas?
Yeah, that's another great question. So inherently in the rule itself, connectivity is not specifically mentioned. But of course, when you bring visible trees into neighborhoods, you bring canopy into neighborhoods, you bring parks close, then actually there's a very good basis for also providing a connected network. So in other work, and also when I present the rule, I always highlight the need for connectivity as one of the key principles for developing green infrastructure, together with things like equity, right, to have equal access to green, proximity, which of course is more inherent to the rule, but also diversity, a diversity of experiences. So it's definitely kind of an underlying quality indicator to make sure we connect a green space. The 30% is basically calculated by looking at a neighborhood, and how you define a neighborhood will depend on where you are in the world, to be honest. And then within that, just to see how much canopy cover there is over the surface. Usually water is, for example, also removed from that equation to give a bit of a fair canopy cover. So there's no requirements to have connected canopy there. So that could be spread out over the neighborhood. And there's some interesting research from the University of British Columbia that is looking at what are the ideal configurations, and that will depend a little bit on the benefits. So climate will have different configuration needs, for example, than health benefits or biodiversity. So I think here we need to really the skills of the designers and the planners to help us to configure that canopy cover in the best possible way at the neighborhood level.
Mm. Well, then how can Australia strategically integrate the principles of what you're doing with the trees rule into planning frameworks so that we can ensure that there is that creation and that design happening across regions and cities, so that there is that connectivity?
Yeah, I think like any country that wants to approach this also more nationally, I think it's important to have a policy, have a strategy that expresses a clear vision for where we want to take green infrastructure in our cities. And that, of course, then connects it to some of the key benefits that we want to achieve. But we'll also need to have some metrics and some performance indicators for where we want to see the green infrastructure develop over time. And I think here we have, of course, as green people, have always been in a bit of an underdog position because of the lack of metrics, of clear evidence-based guidelines of how much green we need. There have been norms in terms of access to parks in many cities, but really not canopy targets per se. That's really emerging recently. Cities like Sydney, of course, have set canopy targets. So I think the combination of having a clear vision, clear indicators where we want to take it, clear priorities, and of course also metrics so that we can really measure our progress. And I think this has to be a long-term ambition. So a long-term vision that is then supported by shorter-term goals as well.
Yes, yeah, definitely. So there's a few things there you touched on I would love to dive into a bit more deeply. So I guess firstly on the metrics, what are the key indicators and metrics that should be used to assess effectiveness and impact of urban green infrastructure projects in Australia? I guess what have you seen internationally that's working really well that we can use to establish robust monitoring and evaluation frameworks?
Yeah, I think there's some really exciting developments. So apart from the 330-300 that is now being used across the world, including in some municipalities in Australia, of course, canopy cover has become a key metric for cities, for example, in North America, but also in Europe, and I know also in Australia. But also things like biodiversity indicators or metrics. So in the United Kingdom, they have a biodiversity net gain framework set up, meaning that if you develop an area or you have a new residential development, your biodiversity has to be higher after development than before. that kind of scoring system that we also see in cities in Sweden actually helps as well. And then I think a very exciting development in the Netherlands is that we last week launched a new national tree norm based on cubic meters of crown volume per area. So actually we say every neighborhood or every square meter or square kilometer, we need to have a certain minimum amount of crown volume to provide those benefits. So I think there's different metrics being developed and implemented. And I think it's possible because we have a lot of research now on how much do we need, what is a good canopy cover, when do people use parks, what kind of diversity do we need. So I think it's a combination of many of those metrics. But I think the good thing with 330-300 is that it combines some of those aspects in terms of exposure, diversity, proximity, etc.
Yeah, I love the crown volume metric. We're moving into that 3D space.
Right. Yeah.
So you also touched on having a national strategy. So we were chatting offline before here, and I was giving Cecil the update on where things are at with that. There's a draft national urban policy coming out, which touches on green and blue spaces. There's also the National Urban Green Infrastructure Handbook, which is not quite a standard, but it is the starting place for these discussions. So in your view, what would be the key elements that should be included in a national, if we got our unicorn national urban green infrastructure strategy for Australia, what would be in it, and how could we go about developing that in a way that ensures collaboration and alignment between, different levels of government and stakeholders from various sectors to achieve those goals?
Yeah, I think it starts from a clear vision, right? So where do you want to see green infrastructure in Australia go? But of course, that also requires then clear targets, and that then relates to making a clear assessment of your current status and really show, well, where do you want to go from there, and how do you achieve that in terms of the instruments that you could mobilize, the kind of funding needs, the role of different partners and stakeholders. And as you already say, I think this is really an undertaking that should involve many different actors and players. We'd also then ask, of course, for coordination and how you bring that all together. So I think based on the existing knowledge, we're able to develop some really clear targets, of course, depending on local needs. But then we really have to mobilize all those resources and players and see where we can actually get some clear synergies going. There's a lot happening already. It's often also a case of bringing things together and directing it a little bit more into the same direction.
Yeah, what is the best platform for bringing people together for those strategic discussions?
Well, I think having a strategy document is a really good idea, and then maybe having some kind of forum or coordination group that would lead it, and that could potentially be, of course, at the national level, but you could also have that trickle down to, for example, the more regional levels. And I've seen some good examples of that in places like Canada. Even though it's not a government policy, they've been trying to have a national strategy and then have that regionally and even locally adjusted to needs. So some kind of forum, I think, maybe some kind of unit like they had in the United Kingdom in the old days, where they had a national urban forestry unit. There was a non-government organization assigned by government to actually lead the implementation of urban forestry in the UK. So I think there are different models. In the US, of course, they have a federal program, which is pretty well structured in terms of implementing their new urban forestry policies. So I think, there are examples where we could see where good practices are and what would actually work in Australia.
Yeah, I love that. I find it is better to have something that stakeholders can pick apart, even if it's bad,
Right.
Get the right people engaged, rather than, it's that saying, perfect is the enemy of good. So trying to get the perfect document out there as the starting point might not be the best approach, and it should be maybe just drafting something with some interested stakeholders and then going more broader for that collaboration.
Yeah, and I think it's a living document too, right? So you may have a vision that's pretty clear, but then, of course, there's a need also to adjust. Things are changing, climate change, etc. We're working a little bit towards a moving target, so we have to be really aware of what's happening around us and adjust to that where needed.
So speaking of those moving targets, given the urgent situation we have facing Perth and in Western Australia, there's a declining urban forest health, canopy loss, really stressed trees that are dying. immediate actions would you recommend for the city of Perth to address this?
Yeah, I had a chance to look at some of the articles behind this, and it is really terrifying. And it does remind me a little bit of some of the situations I've seen in other parts of the world, where we see a rapid decline of urban forest health because of climate change, and then of course all the spin-off effects, pests and diseases, etc. So I think again it's a combination of factors. Of course, realizing that there is a problem is important. Making an assessment and see where the urban forest, what part of the urban forest are mostly affected, and try to develop a strategy for rebuilding, making urban forests more resilient. And that will require different management practices. It will require different selection of tree species and other plant species. Stakeholder mobilization, even involving residents, can be a factor. For example, in terms of watering trees during hot spells, etc. But it does really require a strategy and trying to think, okay, 50 years ahead, what will be the climate here? It's going to be probably even more challenging. So if we select species and develop management methods, we should really do that for that urban forest 40, 50 years down the line, which is hard, of course, because you will have to make some big decisions.
If I had a magic wand, I'd have you develop their rescue package. That would be wonderful. No time limit, no budget limit. Oh, that would be wonderful. Yeah, we do need to move with these moving targets. And on that, I guess, what role can urban green infrastructure play in helping Australian communities and cities adapt and mitigate the impacts of climate change? Because we're seeing really extreme events unfold here, such as heat events, bushfires, flooding we're seeing a lot of. So what role does urban green infrastructure have in mitigating that? And are there any specific nature-based solutions that show promise in this context?
Yeah, I think that role is absolutely essential. And actually, I think Australia is one of the countries that has been showing how important this is in terms of, for example, shade strategies and policies, or places like Sydney that are focusing so much on expanding canopy cover to deal with heat islands, etc. Just here in Europe, in Germany right now, we have massive floods again, and we had the wettest spring on record in many European countries. So definitely we need green infrastructure to make our cities more resilient, to buffer some of those impacts, to make sure that cities remain comfortable most of the year, cool neighborhoods, make sure that people don't die prematurely. Recent studies show that getting 30% canopy cover could reduce premature deaths during heat waves by 1/3. So that means you could actually let people live longer and happier, etc. So for me, it's a no-brainer that we need to think green infrastructure, but of course that comes then in many forms. So trees, canopy, but also cooling buildings to green facades and green roofs, bringing vegetation into schools. We really have to think, where are the pressures and where do we expect the big impacts, and how can we then mitigate those? Ideally through green infrastructure, and not just through air conditioning or other technological solutions that actually will make the problem worse eventually. And then, of course, the nice thing with green infrastructure is that then other benefits come along in terms of biodiversity, in terms of aesthetics, attractive living and working environments, education, you name it. So I think it's not a golden bullet or silver bullet, sorry, but it's definitely a way to go and make our cities more resilient and keep us happy.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. And then do you want to touch on what you were mentioning to me before about what California is doing, their Climate Sister Cities project?
Yeah, that's pretty interesting. So Californian cities, with the help of the California Urban Forest Extension Service, is actually set up a system of sister cities. So a city in North California would look south into South California, or maybe other states, and see, well, this city will have the climate that we expect to have in 40, 50 years from now. What trees are doing well there? How are they cared for? Can we start bringing those trees into our urban forest? So to kind of gradually shift the composition of the urban forest to be prepared for what is coming. And I think that's an interesting approach to learn from each other, to really have a very clear understanding of what kind of tree species, what kind of vegetation will we need. And if we don't do it now, of course, then within a few decades, we're stuck with an urban forest that is not at all thriving. So I think that sister city approach, which is assisted by researchers, and so is a really nice way to go.
It's reminding me of, in my permaculture studies, they taught us about climate and analogies. So you look for climate analogous zones to see what might grow well, but perhaps this is that future thinking, what are we likely to be analogous to in the future? So we have a national research program down here, Which Plant Where. So that's it's testing species for their survivability under different climate scenarios so that we can look at that and see how it might fare in certain areas, because, yeah, that's really important that we're planting the right things for the future climate.
Yeah, and I think also, I mean, cities, of course, are not natural environments in many cases. So already a city, in terms of its surrounding area, will have a different climate. So also that part has to be taken into account. It's a bit of a climate frontier in many cases, and we can actually learn a lot there as well from cities and how we should adapt our more general urban forest around us, for example. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned there.
Yeah, and it's interesting that thinking when we're trying to regenerate a space, what are we regenerating to? It's cities are these highly managed environments. So we're trying to, bring nature into a city in a forest. And of course it's complicated. We've made it very complicated.
Yeah, it is complicated. Also, of course, with things like, as you say, fire issues, right? Which are really important. So you also have to think about that, designing urban forests that are more resilient for fires, and of course thinking about minimizing risks. And so it's a complex question, no doubt.
Well, thanks for that. I would love to pick your brain, because you've got so much international knowledge about what's happening around the world in urban greening. What innovative funding models and investment strategies have proven successful in supporting large-scale urban greening projects that you've seen? And how could Australia implement similar approaches to secure funding for urban green infrastructure initiatives?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, of course, it is still tricky, because we have seen austerity and declining funding in the green space sector, industry, municipal budgets, and so have been on the decline. But on the other end, we've seen, I would say, some large-scale federal reallocation of budget. For example, in the United States, where kind of under the idea of employment and health and climate, large sums have been redirected towards the urban forestry sector, leading to, I don't know, like a 1,000% increase in budget or so. So pretty significant. But that meant, of course, a reallocation of federal resources, of national resources. You see it also in places like Korea and China, where federal programs are pretty big. But of course, also cities can do that. They can start tapping into, let's say, non-green funding streams related to health, climate. And here, of course, they can work together with public utilities, with water companies. Some interesting developments in terms of insurance companies in places like California and others that see the preventive effects of having green on health and on people not needing medical care. So there are some streams there, I think, coming into the picture. Belgium recently adopted the 330-300 rule, not just for its green space sector, but actually also for its health program, especially for its health and climate program. So, and there actually the public health insurance companies have actually seen the importance and starting to support some of the work as well. So I think, we need to diversify funding, I think, combining public sector funding with private sector funding, finding new and innovative funding models. And those can actually be generated around different nature-based solutions, where we see a boom of innovation and new enterprises. But it's all going a little bit slow, to be honest. I would really like to see more of the actual benefits of green infrastructure being rewarded through appropriate funding, and not just public sector funding in that sense.
No, I think that's great advice. So find the hook to the co-benefit, of which we have the benefit of having many, and then finding the groups and the finances or the government departments that are have a vested interest in that benefit, and discuss with them about nature-based solutions and how we can increase urban greening. And that's great advice.
Thank you. Yeah, I think, as I said, that there's a lot of money out there that is generated from the presence of good green infrastructure, but is really not redirected towards establishing planning, design, management of green infrastructure. And I think there's an economic failure there that we have to address.
Yeah, we'll get right on that. So now moving to community engagement, because that's something that we know through our research at Greener Spaces, Better Places is really important to underpin the success of an urban forest, is the community's attitudes and beliefs towards, greenery and urban forestry in general. So how can we effectively engage and empower local communities in the planning, design and management of urban green spaces to ensure their needs and preferences are incorporated into the decision-making process?
This is really essential, I think, and without having residents, communities on board, of course, is going to be very difficult to implement good urban greening or green infrastructure strategies. And there are a lot of good examples around, I think, and we're also getting better in maybe learning from those, but it's all still a little bit fragmented. And here I think we have to really make the combination, right, between those strategies and funding programs and also citizen engagement, citizen agency, citizen action. Cities like Seattle that are trying to find funding models to support private landowners to plant trees and take care of trees, maybe with some expert help, and to maintain tree canopy on their own property. And I think, getting people engaged based on the understanding that actually these trees are doing a lot of good for us. There could be emotional values. There could be, of course, the cooling that people can experience. The tree in their neighbor's garden, it actually helps them cool their garden. So I think there are ways, I think, of touching the hearts and minds of people, and to make sure that they also have a way to influence then how their urban forest looks, how it's taken care of. And there will be a balance sometimes of residents' ideas and professional ideas of what the urban forest should look like. And that could have to do with cultural meaning of trees, for example, that we see in many multicultural cities today. So I think there's many ways, but it's, as you say, absolutely essential that we keep communities on board and make them a big part of implementing these strategies. Oh, I think you're muted, Belinda, sorry.
Sorry, I have a bit of a cold, so I didn't want to hear me blow my nose. Yeah, no, you're spot on. I think, people are going to be critical in achieving what we want to achieve, especially when it comes to biodiversity in our cities. We need human intervention for that to happen and to maintain that. Have you seen any good examples of urban greening that is designed for the benefit specifically of biodiversity and ecological resilience?
Yeah, yes, I have, definitely. And I think so metrics or programs like the biodiversity net gain or the so-called Malmö green space factor actually trying to really promote biodiversity and see, well, what are the elements of biodiversity that we find important. In the Netherlands, we have this program of nature inclusive building that's also trying to quantify and develop some metrics for biodiversity. But I have to say, I really like the approaches in cities like Berlin or Zurich that actually giving more space to wilder nature and say, well, actually, we need to be able to let nature do some of the work. We shouldn't prescribe everything. And in Berlin, it also has meant that people have gotten used to kind of a wilder aesthetic, a little bit more messiness of urban nature, and are very happy with it. So you see the grass is longer, dead trees are in the woodlands, etc. So I do see definitely interesting elements there. And a group of us coined that once nature-based thinking. So rather than nature-based solutions, we should integrate kind of a nature-based thinking approach to planning and designing our cities. And I think there are elements of that we can learn from different places. Places like Singapore that also combine kind of a pretty well-maintained green infrastructure with also some wilder spots. And of course, in a tropical place, it's hard to fully control nature. So you have to work with nature in those kind of circumstances.
Mm. Oh, that's great. I love nature-based thinking. That's really cool. And it's great to see that communities are embracing that wilder aesthetic. It gives me hope that we can change and, rewild some areas for the benefit of biodiversity. So as I mentioned to you offline, greener spaces, better places, we're very much about trying to share the knowledge and improve capacity building efforts amongst all practitioners that touch on the urban greening space. How can we improve that? What do you see in terms of knowledge sharing and capacity building to foster innovation for urban greening around the world that's been working?
I think during recent years, I've seen a lot of initiatives to bring experts together, not just nationally, but also regionally and globally. So I think the work of international organizations, FAO, the Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN, was taking an urban mandate on. Also the AEPH, I think they're called, the global kind of nursery and plant production sector. And doing things, for example, like Green City Award programs, and also using those to foster kind of an exchange of ideas and peer learning. We organize now 2 World Forum on Urban Forests as well. They bring together 1,000 or so greening professionals, including colleagues from Australia. And of course, also, I mean, through online resources and journals and platforms, we have really great opportunities now to exchange. So I think the tools are there and the networks are developing. So yeah, we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We can often learn a lot from cities elsewhere. And although circumstances are different, kind of some of the overall challenges are often pretty similar. So I think, yeah, to foster and to keep doing that and share good practice and learn from each other will be pretty important.
Yeah, doing that sister cities model, looking at what's working in a city that has a climate analogy for us, for our future.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the idea of twinning is also something I'm always very much in favor of. So cities that can learn from each other, that could be north-south twinning, east-west, regional twinning. There's often ways of actually mutual benefits between cities if they start learning from each other.
We had RMIT University down here do our last benchmarking analysis of canopy across Australia, and they found 3 critical things that meant a city was a twin or not. It was urbanity, how spacious the blocks were, or how built up it was, and population, how dense it was, urbanity, and rainfall.
Okay, yeah.
So we could learn more maybe from those analogous towns and cities than we can from the one that's, just next door, if it's experiencing less or more rainfall or it's less populous, for example.
Yeah, that's right, of course, right? And maybe a city like Sydney can learn more from, let's say, Malmö, right? And maybe from its neighboring cities as well. And on the other end, a smaller city in Australia may benefit a lot from having a smaller Dutch city and see how they're doing things, or a smaller Spanish city. So I think you're right. I think the conditions are different and you can actually develop different ways of twinning and networking.
Well, that's great that these are all developing. Maybe we need nature-based think tanks.
That's a good one. I like that. Yeah, that's great.
So you touched on equity earlier, and that being an important part of sort of a national strategic approach to urban greening. What strategies can be employed to address potential disparities in access and distribution of greening across Australia?
Yeah, I think that this is a really key issue, and I think this is driving a lot of the interesting policies and strategies across the world these days. In the US, in Europe, and UK has really been picking this up. And I think it's really important to assess and identify where are the places where low canopy and low green infrastructure overlap with vulnerable populations. And that could be people that have lower income, that could be people of different cultural backgrounds, etc. And to really see, okay, in these weak spots or hot spots, how can we prioritize those to develop our green infrastructure, develop our urban forest? And I think that's exactly the approach that people take with this kind of tree equity framework that the US and the UK are using now. But of course, then the next step is, okay, great, but you have to work with the community as well, because there are sometimes reasons why people are a little bit hesitant to have trees in their neighborhoods. They have maybe a distrust of government, or they fear that maintenance is not being done properly, or it's the wrong type of tree species, etc. So I think apart from that assessment and prioritization, finding really good community-based approaches to then expand the urban forest to green infrastructure would be essential.
Yeah, great. Thank you for that. And finally, what is the best way for everyone to stay in touch with you and follow your work?
So people can follow me on LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. So if you're on LinkedIn, feel free to follow or connect. I post a lot there about things that fascinate me in this domain, things I'm doing, but also my colleagues are doing. So I think that's probably a very good way. I'm also on X, but I'm a little bit less active there. So I would say LinkedIn, and people are always more than welcome to reach out and send me a message. if they have specific ideas or questions, and I'll do my best to get back as soon as I can.
Well, Professor Konijnendijk, it has been an absolute pleasure talking with you and hearing all about the trees rule, the threes rule, the 330-300. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much for taking your time pro bono to help us and help us, rise. The rising tide lifts all boats. So we really do appreciate you helping us down under. We need you. We need all the help we can get. So much
Thank you so much. And no, you're more than welcome. And good luck with all the great work you're doing. And I'm always keeping a keen eye on Australia, because I know also some really interesting innovations are coming from there that we can implement elsewhere. So thanks so much for continuing the dialogue.
Thank you.